Jeffrey Epstein. Now, that's a name that's basically become shorthand for scandal, right? But beyond all the headlines, there's a much more complex story here. It's a story about power, about wealth, and about secrecy. So in this explainer, we're going to dive into this system, the actual architecture of influence that Epstein spent decades building to operate at the very highest levels of society.
And it all really boils down to this one huge question. How does a college dropout who's teaching math at an elite high school manage to transform himself into this mysterious financier, a confidant to some of the most powerful people on the planet? Well, to find that answer, we've got to go back to the very beginning.
To really get a handle on the empire he built, we have to start at the beginning, in a world that was a million miles away from private islands and fancy Manhattan mansions.
So Jeffrey Epstein grew up in a pretty modest home in Brooklyn. His dad was a groundskeeper. But even from a young age, people who knew him said he was different. Sure, he was brilliant with numbers, but where he really shined was in studying people. He was described as a keen observer of power dynamics. He was way more interested in figuring out influential adults than just hanging out with kids his own age. And that trait would really define his entire life.
In his rise, it was shockingly fast. In 1974, he lands a teaching gig at the Dalton School. Now, this wasn't just any school. It was a direct pipeline to the kids of New York's most powerful and wealthy families. Just 2 years later, he parlayed those connections into a job at the investment bank Bear Stearns, and get this, with no college degree. By 1981, he was already out on his own, ready to build his own thing.
And the thing is, what he built, it was nothing like your typical Wall Street firm. He created a club so exclusive, it basically rewrote the rules of wealth management.
Okay, get this. The price of entry to his new firm, J. Epstein & Co., was a net worth of at least $1 billion. I mean, just think about that for a second. This rule wasn't just about the money, right? It was about creating this aura of ultimate, untouchable exclusivity. By saying he only served billionaires, he was sending a message that his services were so unique, so valuable, that only the absolute wealthiest people in the world could even get in the door.
His whole method was just a world away from your typical advisor. See, most advisors manage your money. Epstein managed his clients' entire lives. He wasn't pushing stocks and bonds. He was selling answers to the kinds of problems that even $1 billion can't just make disappear. He focused on the psychology of the ultra-rich, their absolute need for secrecy, their incredibly complex tax issues, their desire to control their legacy. He basically became the go-to problem solver for a class of people whose problems are unlike anyone else's.
And his really big break? That came through his relationship with retail magnate Leslie Wexner. Wexner eventually gave Epstein power of attorney, which is just an extraordinary, almost unheard of level of trust. It meant Epstein could make massive financial decisions for Wexner, all on his own. For an outsider like him, this was the ultimate stamp of approval. It cemented his credibility and blew open every door in the world of high finance. So now he has the credibility, he has the capital, and he starts building the physical empire that would become the literal stage for everything he did.
Epstein really understood a basic truth about power. It needs a place to live. And for him, his properties, they weren't just homes. They were strategic pieces on a chessboard, each with its own special purpose in his network.
Okay, so you had the Manhattan townhouse. That was his networking command center. Then there was the Palm Beach estate, which gave him prime access to the vacationing elite. His ranch out in New Mexico, that was for near total privacy and control. And then the private island in the U.S. Virgin Islands, Little St. James, that was for the ultimate absolute isolation from the rest of the world.
And this whole sprawling physical empire, it operated under its own strict, unspoken set of rules. It was a whole architecture of control.
So how did he maintain that control? Well, it came down to a few key things. Staff had to sign these ironclad confidentiality agreements. His finances were a tangled mess, hidden in a web of offshore companies. And his associate, Ghislaine Maxwell, she was the one who acted as the social gatekeeper, connecting him to the international elite. Every single piece was designed for one thing: total secrecy.
For decades, it really seemed like this fortress he built was impenetrable. But then, in the mid-2000s, the first tiny cracks started to show.
And it all started with a single phone call, a call to the Palm Beach police back in 2005. A parent reported that their teenage daughter was offered cash to give Epstein a massage at his mansion. Just that one complaint, that's what kicked off the investigation that would start to peel back the first layer of this whole secret world.
And what investigators found pretty quickly was that this wasn't some one-off incident. No, it was a system, a pattern. Young women, many of them teenagers, would be approached, brought to the mansion, paid a couple $100 after the encounter, and then, in some cases, encouraged to go out and recruit their friends. This pointed to something way more organized. So, as investigators, both local and federal, started putting the evidence together, it really looked like this whole thing was headed for a massive trial. But what happened next would become one of the most talked about, most controversial legal deals in recent history.
See, instead of facing a jury, Epstein's team of high-powered lawyers went to work behind the scenes. They negotiated a plea deal directly with federal prosecutors, and most of it happened in secret.
And the deal they came up with was, well, it was stunning. All the potential federal trafficking charges just dropped, gone. Instead, he pleaded guilty to only 2 lesser state charges. And the sentence? Not a long prison term, but just 18 months in a county jail. And even that came with work release, which meant he could leave for up to 12 hours a day, 6 days a week.
But here's the part that really stood out. The deal didn't just protect Epstein. It also gave immunity from federal prosecution to 4 named co-conspirators and, this is the astonishing part, any potential unnamed ones. This one clause basically slammed the door on any wider investigation. And as you can imagine, it sparked outrage and questions that would just fester for more than a decade.
Which really leaves us with this final, kind of unsettling thought. From his early days just watching how power worked in Brooklyn, to building this massive empire of secrecy, Epstein engineered a world that was designed to be impossible to penetrate. And it brings up a really fundamental question. When wealth and influence build a fortress like that, what does it actually take for the rest of us to see what's going on inside?
So today, we're going to deconstruct one of the most notorious and honestly most mysterious social networks in recent memory. We're going to peel back all the layers and really try to understand the mechanics of how this thing was built, who was really holding the blueprints, and how influence is actually manufactured behind the scenes. And that really brings us to the central puzzle, doesn't it? I mean, how does an outsider get a seat at the table with some of the most powerful people on the planet? We see someone like Jeffrey Epstein, and we have to ask, how did he get there? He definitely wasn't born into that world. So how does somebody from the outside manage to not just break in, but become a permanent fixture in these incredibly exclusive circles? It all comes down to access. And the answer, well, it's almost never what you think. Here's the thing you have to understand to make sense of any of this. This network wasn't some happy accident. It wasn't just a series of lucky breaks. No, this was meticulously designed. It was a project, a work of social architecture. And like any great project, it needed an architect. At the very heart of this network was this really fascinating dynamic. You had Epstein, who brought this whole aura of mystery and, this vague sense of immense financial power. But he himself was kind of reserved, calculating. And then you had Ghislaine Maxwell, who was the total opposite, completely outgoing, incredibly charismatic, and just supremely confident. And that contrast, that wasn't a problem for them. It was actually the engine that made the whole thing run. He had the money and the mystique. She was the one who knew how to build that into an empire of access. Let's be really clear about this. Epstein might have been the name everyone knew, but Maxwell, she was the key. She's the one who unlocked all the doors. I mean, her background as the daughter of the infamous media tycoon Robert Maxwell, that gave her something Epstein could never, ever buy, an inherited passport into the world of the elite. She didn't have to ask for an invitation. She was basically born inside the club. Okay, so her background was the golden ticket, right, that got them in the door, but it was her very specific set of skills that allowed them to go from just being guests at the party to basically building and hosting a world of their own. So let's break down the skills that she brought to the table. Her real superpower was this deep, intuitive understanding of the unwritten, subtle rules that govern the world of the super rich and powerful. It's a world that operates on a whole different set of social cues. And Maxwell didn't just know these rules, she had mastered them. She could navigate these complex social currents, the hidden alliances, the etiquette, all the stuff that's totally invisible to outsiders. That was her unique expertise. And what they were doing? Well, there's actually a name for it: social architecture. Now, this isn't just about networking, it's way more deliberate. It's the strategic, almost brick-by-brick construction of a social world. Every single introduction, every dinner party, every connection they made was another brick being laid in this massive structure of influence and access. So how did they actually build this thing? How did it work in practice? Well, we can break her method down into 4 very distinct foundational roles. Just think of them as the 4 pillars that held the entire structure up. And here they are: the facilitator, the hostess, the maintainer, and the validator. Each one of these roles was absolutely essential, and they all worked together perfectly. So let's break down exactly what each one means. All right, first up, she was the facilitator. This is probably the most straightforward role to understand. She was the one on Epstein's arm at all the galas, the fundraisers, the private parties. She was the one making the introductions, vouching for him, and using her own connections to literally pull him into the room with all these powerful people. She was the bridge from his world to theirs. Second, she was the hostess. Now, being a guest is one thing, but being the host, that's a whole different level of power. By creating their own exclusive events, they completely shifted the center of gravity. Suddenly, they weren't just looking for access anymore. They were the ones providing it. This social partnership made them a destination. And just look at the kind of people they were getting to show up. This wasn't just about glamour and celebrity. Their guest lists were this really strategic mix of intellectual power, financial capital, cultural influence, and political leverage. Every single person on that list added a different kind of value and prestige to their growing network. The third pillar was the maintainer. A network isn't something you just build once and walk away from. It needs constant upkeep. And Maxwell's outgoing personality was absolutely perfect for this. Epstein might have the first serious conversation, but she was the one who could follow up, strengthen that bond, and just generally keep all those connections warm and active. She was the social glue holding it all together. And finally, we have what might be the most subtle, but also the most critical role of all: the validator. Just by being there, standing next to him, with her famous name and her background, she gave Epstein this invisible stamp of approval. Her presence basically broadcasted a message to everyone else in the room. He's one of us. He belongs here. She was essentially lending him her own social currency. And you really can't overstate how important that was. For a guy like Epstein, who was trying to project this image of incredible wealth and intellect, but had a murky background, having a validator like Maxwell was, as one source put it, extremely valuable. It was the ultimate endorsement in a world where, let's be honest, perception is pretty much everything. Okay, so we have these 4 pillars. We have this really intricate social architecture that they've built. But it all begs the question: what was it all for? What was the ultimate goal of this massive, years-long project? Well, the goal was something called controlled visibility, and this is just a masterclass in how modern power works. It's not about being famous in the way a celebrity is. It's about being known by the right people. The whole point was to be influential enough behind the scenes to shape events and get access to information, all while staying just under the radar of public attention and, importantly, public scrutiny. So over time, Maxwell's role grew into being the ultimate gatekeeper. She wasn't just opening doors anymore. She was controlling who came in and who went out. She was managing the flow of information, and she was using all that social standing she'd built to help Epstein navigate and ultimately manipulate these incredibly elite spaces. And all of this leaves us with one last question. We've just deconstructed a network from the recent past, but the principles we've talked about, social architecture, facilitators, validators, those are timeless. And it makes you wonder, doesn't it? Who are the architects out there right now, building the invisible networks of power and influence that are shaping our world today? To really understand how power is built, you can't just look at the end result. You've got to go all the way back to the beginning. We're diving into a story of incredible influence, but our starting point, it's not a boardroom, it's not a private jet, it's somewhere else entirely. And that brings us to the real puzzle, right? How did Jeffrey Epstein, a guy who would become this huge force in high finance, even get his foot in the door? Well, the answer isn't on Wall Street. It's in a place that's kind of ordinary on the surface, but actually, it was a brilliant strategic move. Yep, that's right. Before all the private islands and the billion-dollar funds, Epstein's first real gig was as a teacher. And this isn't just some random factoid for a biography. This classroom is the exact place where he forged the blueprint for his entire career. But listen, this wasn't just any school. Epstein somehow landed a job at the Dalton School, an institution that was way more than just a place to learn. It was a nerve center of influence. Let's really dig into why this specific place was so important. So he gets a job teaching physics and math at the Dalton School, right there in Manhattan. Now, you have to understand, Dalton wasn't and isn't just a school. Think of it more like a hub, a nexus of pure influence where the next generation of New York's absolute elite is groomed. And when I say elite, I mean the real deal. We're talking about the kids of the country's most powerful people. Their parents were the titans of finance, the biggest names in politics, and the moguls running massive companies. This school was basically a concentrated ecosystem of power. So here's the key thing to get. For him, the teaching job itself was never the point. It was the key to a door. It gave him legitimate, face-to-face access to the exact networks of wealth and power that he was desperate to be a part of. Okay, so once he's inside, the way he acted was, well, it was incredibly telling. People who knew him back then said it was like he was playing two different roles at the exact same time. On one hand, everyone said he was this brilliant teacher. He had this commanding presence, and he was genuinely good at making really complex stuff easy for her students to understand. But then there was this other side to him, a much more calculating one, the quiet, detached social observer. And this quote from someone who knew him there, man, it just nails that split personality perfectly. It gives you this picture of a guy who wasn't just there to teach, no way. He was studying the social dynamics, taking mental notes on who was related to whom, and basically mapping out the entire power structure around him. And this was not just him sitting back and watching from a distance. Oh no. Former students actually remember how openly fascinated he was with their family's success. He'd apparently asked them straight-up questions about how much money their parents had and how powerful they were. It showed this deep, obsessive interest in this new world he'd entered. So, let's put it all together. What does this all mean? It shows that his time at Dalton wasn't just a job. It was the invention of a strategy he could use over and over again, a blueprint for how to manufacture influence from scratch. Let's just break this blueprint down real quick. Step 1. Get yourself into an exclusive elite world. In this case, Dalton. Step 2. Get a legitimate job, like teacher, to use as a cover story. Step 3. Watch everything. Meticulously map out the social food chain. And finally, step 4. Use all that information and all those connections to get what you want. When you look at it like that, his time at Dalton becomes crystal clear, doesn't it? It was a dress rehearsal. He was practicing for the much bigger stage of global finance, perfecting a method he would later use to build his entire empire. So what's the final takeaway from this early, super important chapter of his life? Well, it all really boils down to one simple thing. The most valuable thing he got from that classroom wasn't his salary, not even close. It was access. Access to people, access to networks, and access to a world of power that for a guy like him should have been totally unreachable. And that kind of leaves us with one last big question to chew on. Forget this one story for a second. It makes you wonder, in the real world of finance, politics, and power, how often is it that the real currency isn't money, but just access, proximity to power itself? Okay, so how on earth did Jeffrey Epstein get to be so powerful? It's a huge question, right? Well, according to the sources we're looking at today, the answer really boils down to one single pivotal relationship. It's this story of an architect and an apprentice. And that's where the foundation for everything, all of his influence, was laid. I mean, think about it. How does a little-known financial advisor suddenly become this so-called financier to billionaires? It just doesn't happen overnight. So in this explainer, we're going to walk you through the blueprint for that transformation, piece by piece. All right, here's how we're going to break it down. First, we'll look at the architect and the apprentice themselves. Then we'll get into the key, this just unprecedented level of power that was handed over. After that, you'll see how that translated into controlling a whole empire, which in turn created this currency of credibility. And all of that led to the final product, becoming a financier to billionaires. So let's start at the beginning, back in the 1980s. On the surface, this looks like a story about a billionaire and his financial guy. But as we'll see, this relationship was anything but conventional, and it's right here that the seeds of immense power were planted. And this, right here, this really paints the picture, doesn't it? On one hand, You've got Leslie Wexner, a billionaire retail magnate, a total titan in his field. And on the other hand, Jeffrey Epstein, a financial advisor who, back then, was basically a nobody. I mean, the difference in status, it's just staggering. And this brings us to the core claim from our source material. Wexner wasn't just another client. The assertion is that he was the architect of Epstein's rise, the one who literally built his career from the ground up. So you might be wondering, how did he do it? Well, it all started with a single legal document, a grant of power so sweeping that our sources call it extraordinary. Okay, before we go any further, let's make sure we're all on the same page about what this actually means. A power of attorney, this isn't just about giving someone advice. No, this is giving someone the legal authority to act as you. They can sign contracts for you, move your money, make huge financial decisions, all as if they are you. It's a massive deal. And this is why it's so significant. Handing over this much control to an outside advisor, it was, and I'm quoting here, almost unheard of in the world of high finance. This just didn't happen. It was not normal procedure at all.
Let's put that in the simplest terms. This piece of paper gave Epstein the keys to the kingdom. He could legally run Wexner's massive financial life as if he were Wexner. This wasn't just a little influence. This was total, actionable control.
Okay, so what does that kind of power actually look like in the real world? Well, that legal document wasn't just sitting in a file cabinet. It was the key that unlocked the door to running a massive, incredibly complex retail empire. So what did that control actually look like day to day? Well, here you go. Epstein wasn't just on the sidelines giving advice. He was in the game. He was actively managing financial accounts, buying property, and handling these incredibly complex deals, all for one of the richest men in the country. Just think about that for a second. It's like he was given a masterclass, a real-life apprenticeship in how to manage a billionaire's fortune. He was getting this incredible hands-on experience that you just can't get anywhere else. It was priceless. But this whole story isn't just about money or experience. The next critical step in this transformation was taking all that power and turning it into something even more valuable: social credibility. You see, when a guy like Les Wexner trusts you with his entire fortune, that sends a huge message to the rest of the world. It's the ultimate stamp of approval. It basically tells everyone in those elite circles, this guy is legit. And just like that, his entire standing skyrocketed. Yeah, as the source puts it so well, doors that were previously closed began to open. Wexner's trust was like a master key. Suddenly, Epstein had access. He had legitimacy. He could walk into rooms and be taken seriously in a way that was totally impossible for him before. And you can see that transformation right here. He went from being this sort of consultant with a mysterious background to a proven, established figure of influence. And that whole change, it was powered by Wexner's very public vote of confidence. So let's pull it all together now. Let's look at how all these different pieces, the legal power, the financial control, the social credibility, came together to build his final persona. So this is it. This is the blueprint for how he built his influence. You've got the legal backing from the power of attorney. You have the hands-on financial control of a whole empire. And then you have the social currency that came from Wexner's public trust. Those three things right there, that was the entire foundation. The takeaway here, according to the source material, is that Wexner acted as the catalyst. He provided all the essential elements, the legal, the financial, and the social, that allowed Epstein to morph into the figure he would become known as, a financier to billionaires. In all of this, really, it brings us to one final, pretty heavy question. It's a question about trust and power and ultimately accountability. When one person gives another the keys to an entire empire, who's responsible for what they end up building with them? You know, every big name, especially the notorious ones, has an origin story. For Jeffrey Epstein, the blueprint for his influence wasn't forged out in the public eye. Nope. It was built inside the aggressive, high-stakes world of a Wall Street giant. So today, we're diving into his time at Bear Stearns. And really, this whole thing boils down to one central question. What does it actually take to influence the world's most powerful people? Is it just having a ton of money or being some kind of genius? Or is there something else, some hidden currency at play? Well, for Epstein, the answer really started coming together right here at Bear Stearns. And you have to understand, this wasn't just his first big job. It was his laboratory. It was the training ground where he meticulously crafted the methods that would pretty much define the rest of his life. So let's break down this really unique education he got. This was not your typical climb up the corporate ladder. Nope. It was more like this calculated two-part curriculum that it seems he designed for himself. Okay, so his focus was split right down the middle into two very different areas. On one hand, you have the trade, basically mastering the super complex machinery of high finance. And on the other hand, the people, which was all about a deep, systematic study of the human beings who are actually pulling the levers of that machinery. And here's the kicker. He went after both at the exact same time. That parallel approach, that's the crucial detail here. All right, so let's start with track one, the hard skills. I mean, to make it on Wall Street, you've got to speak the language, right? And that language, it's all built on these really complex financial instruments. So he zeroed in on stuff like options trading. Now, I know this can sound super complicated, but just think of it like this. It's like placing a bet on the future price of something without actually having to buy the thing itself. It's a really high leverage tool, and it requires this incredibly deep understanding of how markets work. And, of course, risk. And listen, this is really the key point. He didn't just learn this stuff to get by. No, from all accounts, he absolutely mastered it. This technical skill became his foundation. It was his ticket in the door, the thing that gave him a legit reason to even be in the same room as these ultra-wealthy individuals. But, and this is a big but, that technical skill was only half the story. Okay, so now let's get to the second part. And you could argue this is the more unique part of his education. Decoding the people themselves. This had nothing to do with spreadsheets or algorithms. This was all about human nature. So he apparently developed this whole process. Step one was just to observe. He would just watch how his coworkers and his bosses behaved, what made them tick, what they were afraid of. Then, step two, he'd identify the real drivers behind all that behavior. You know, their ambitions, their insecurities, all of it. And then finally, and this is the most critical part, he would leverage that insight. And look, the purpose here was crystal clear. This was not just some idle people watching. According to what we've seen in the source material, he learned how to manipulate these psychological drivers for a very specific reason, to better serve his elite clients. It was a cold, calculated tool, a strategy designed to make himself absolutely indispensable. So what do you get when you mix these two completely different skill sets together? You don't just end up with a good trader or someone who's good at reading people. No, you create something else entirely. And that combination, that was his real innovation. Fusing that hard financial know-how with this soft psychological insight, that's what took him to another level. Suddenly, he wasn't just another guy on the floor executing trades. He became a specialized strategist. He was offering a service that went way beyond just the numbers on a balance sheet. And that became the foundation for his own firm. So when you look back, his time at Bear Stearns was so much more than a job. It was really an incubation period. He came out of it with this incredibly powerful toolkit. He had the technical expertise, which made him credible. He had these proven strategies of influence, which made him persuasive. He built a high-level social network, which gave him access. And he developed a reputation for extreme secrecy, which is how he built trust. These four things, these were the core assets he would use for decades. And all of this brings us right back to that question we started with, but with a new twist. In that world of extreme wealth and power, what's really the greater asset? Is it what you know, the technical stuff, the market knowledge, or is it who you understand, that deep psychological grasp of the people who actually make the markets move? It's a really interesting question, and it's one that the blueprint forged at Bear Stearns kind of forces you to think about.
So how does someone go from having a regular job to building a launch pad for just immense power and influence? Today, we're going to take a look at a pretty controversial but really powerful case study, the career blueprint that was forged by Jeffrey Epstein during his time at Bear Stearns. Now look, we're not here to analyze the man himself, but the mechanics of the machine he built. This blueprint for turning employment into a full-blown enterprise. Let's break it down.
Yeah, this is the big question, isn't it? Making that jump from employee to a real player, well, that takes a lot more than
Hey, if you're fascinated by real investigations, hidden evidence, and the stories behind the headlines, Make sure you subscribe to Crime Evidence Files. Every week we uncover new case files, interrogation tapes, and courtroom revelations that most people never see. Subscribe now and turn on notifications so you never miss the next case. Click the next video to uncover more investigation files together.